The laughter started before he had even finished planting the first row. Not loud laughter, not the kind meant to be heard, the kind that travels between two men standing at a fence line, one of them watching and the other working, carrying just far enough to let the person working know that they are being watched and found ridiculous. Dale Mercer heard it on the third morning, a Tuesday in early April of 2019, when he was knee-deep in the work of setting the 43rd tree of what would eventually be 430, and his neighbor Roy Kitts was standing at the fence line with his coffee mug, and what Dale could only describe as the specific posture of a man who has already decided the outcome of something and is watching the beginning of it with the pleasure of confirmed expectations. Roy Kitts ran 380 acres of conventional row crops in Whilhe County, Mississippi. He was 54 years old, had inherited the land from his father, and farmed it the way his father had farmed it, and his father's father before that. Soybeans and corn in rotation, inputs managed by the county extension recommendations, yields that were consistent and unremarkable, the kind of operation that produced a living without producing anything that anyone would drive out of their way to see. Roy was not a bad farmer. He was a thoroughly adequate one, which in Whilhe County in 2019 was good enough to get by and not good enough to get ahead. Dale Mercer was 63 years old and had been farming the adjacent 120 acres since he bought them out of estate in 2004, when the previous owner's family had sold the land after the patriarch passed and none of the children wanted to take it on. He had paid for the land over 15 years of careful farming, corn and soybeans like everyone else in the county, and had paid off the mortgage in 2019, with the specific satisfaction of a man who has finished a thing he started with full intention and has not deviated from the plan regardless of the years it took. The year he paid off the land was also the year the corn market did what it sometimes did, which was to slide at exactly the moment when a farmer who had been running lean to service a mortgage found himself looking at the numbers for the coming season and understanding that running the same operation in the same way on the same ground without the mortgage pressure did not solve the underlying problem, which was that his yields per acre were about what anyone else in the county was producing on similar ground. His input costs were about what anyone else was paying, and the margin at the end of a good year was narrow enough that a bad year or a bad market could erase 2 or 3 good years in a single season. He had been thinking about this for 3 years before he paid off the land, thinking about it the way a man thinks about a problem that has no immediate solution available, systematically and persistently, reading and asking questions and driving to farm meetings and talking to people who were doing things differently, and evaluating what he heard against the specific reality of his own 120 acres. He had read about agroforestry, the practice of integrating trees with crops or livestock in ways that produce multiple income streams from the same land base while building long-term soil health. He had read specifically about alley cropping systems in the lower Mississippi Delta region, where rows of trees planted at intervals across a field produced timber or nut crops over a longer time horizon, while the alleys between them continued to produce row crops in the short and medium term. He had talked to an extension forester at Mississippi State University named Dr. Calvin Reyes, who had been working in agroforestry systems in the Delta for 12 years, and who had walked Dale through the economics and the agronomy of what a well-designed alley cropping system could look like on ground with Dale's soil type and rainfall profile. He had also looked at the specific market for high-value hardwood timber in Mississippi and the Gulf South, particularly for the species that performed well in alley cropping systems on alluvial bottom ground, of which his 60 acres in the lower section qualified. The numbers he had found, confirmed by Dr. Reyes and by a timber consultant named Frank Hollis, who had assessed similar plantings in the region, were not the dramatic short-term returns of commodity row crop farming. They were the slow, compounding returns of timber that appreciated in value as it grew, and that reached a harvest or thinning threshold that produced significant income at the 15-year and 25-year marks, with additional income from thinning operations in the years between. all while the alley crops between the tree rows continued to produce income every season. The species he had settled on after 3 years of research and 2 conversations with Dr. Whilhe. Reyes, and one with Frank Hollis, and one February afternoon spent at a demonstration agroforestry planting at a research station near Starkville, was eastern cottonwood in the wetter lower sections and cherry bark oak in the better drained middle sections, with a small block of pecan at the highest and driest ground in the northwest corner of the property. Eastern cottonwood for its exceptional growth rate in alluvial bottomland, producing harvestable timber in 12 to 15 years, a time frame that was unusual for hardwood species and that made the economics of an alley cropping system work in a way that longer rotation species could not. Cherry bark oak for its long-term value, one of the most commercially prized hardwood species in the South, growing slowly but building value steadily toward a 25-year harvest that Frank Hollis had estimated. At current market projections discounted conservatively, would produce more income per acre than any comparable period of row crop production on that ground. Pecan for the annual nut crop that would begin generating income in the 5th to 7th year. The middle horizon cash flow that bridged the gap between the first tree planting costs and the first timber harvests. He had done the analysis 3 times with different price assumptions: pessimistic, moderate, and optimistic. Working with Dr. Reyes on the yield projections, and Frank Hollis on the timber market assumptions, and his own careful records on what his row crop ground had produced across 15 years of farming it. In all 3 scenarios, the agroforestry system outperformed the row crop baseline over a 25-year horizon. In the pessimistic scenario, it outperformed it by 31%, in the moderate scenario by 68%. In the optimistic scenario, the number was large enough that Dale had set it aside as not useful for planning purposes, because he did not make decisions on optimistic scenarios. The planning had taken 3 years. The planting took 9 weeks in the spring of 2019. He had engaged a contractor from the Delta region named Bobby Tran, who had planted agroforestry demonstration systems for the Mississippi State Extension Program for 8 years, and who knew how to set a tree in alluvial bottom ground correctly, the right depth and the right spacing, and the right post-planting care for each species in each soil zone of Dale's property. Bobby brought 2 workers and a tractor-mounted tree planter, and they moved methodically across the lower 60 acres in the first 3 weeks, setting eastern cottonwood transplants at 20-foot spacing in rows that were 60 feet apart, leaving the 60-foot alleys for continued row crop production. Then they moved to the middle section and set the cherry bark oak bare root seedlings in the same pattern, 60-foot rows. 20-foot in-row spacing, the seedlings small and unremarkable in the turned soil, the kind of planting that required imagination to see as what it would be, rather than what it currently was. Roy Kitts appeared at the fence line on the 3rd morning of the cherry bark oak planting. He stood there with his coffee and watched Bobby's crew set a row of seedlings in the middle field section, small brown sticks with root systems barely larger than a man's fist, going into the ground at intervals that looked, from the fence line, like someone was doing something very slow and very deliberate for reasons that were not immediately obvious. He called across the fence line. He asked Dale what he was putting in. Dale said trees. Roy said what kind of trees. Dale said cherry bark oak in the middle section and cottonwood in the bottom. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dale, that is cropland you're putting trees in." Dale said yes. Roy said cherry bark oak. He said that was a 20-year tree. He asked Dale how old he was. Dale said 63. Roy said nothing after that. But the expression on his face when he turned back toward his own property was the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he already believed, which was that the person on the other side of the fence line had made a decision that could not be rationally defended, and that any further comment was unnecessary, because the outcome was already clear to anyone thinking straight. That was where the laughter had started. Not the sound of it, the posture of it. Dale had expected this. He had not expected it from Roy specifically, but he had expected it generally, because he had been farming in Yalobusha County long enough to know that any departure from the way things were done in the county would be watched and commented on and evaluated against the county standard, which was the standard of what everyone else was doing, and that the county standard was not especially interested in what would happen in 20 years when the things being commented on today had either worked or not. The county standard was interested in what was happening this season. Dale's planting was not happening this season, not in any visible way that the county standard could evaluate against its own measures. He finished the cottonwood planting in the lower section and the cherry bark oak in the middle section by late April. He planted the pecan block in the northwest corner in early May, 24 trees in a 4x6 arrangement, the kind of pecan planting that a man made when he intended to be on the land long enough to see what it became rather than what it currently was. Bobby Tran's crew finished the work on a Friday afternoon, and Bobby gave Dale a planting map and a care schedule, and shook his hand and said that the hardest part of an agroforestry planting was always the first 2 years before the trees were established, and that if Dale got through the first 2 years with reasonable survival rates, the system would start to look after itself. Dale walked the planting that evening after Bobby's truck had gone, moving slowly along the cottonwood rows in the lower section, where the trees were 18 inches tall and impossibly fragile looking, against a scale of 60 acres of alluvial bottom ground, and then through the oak rows in the middle section, where the bare root seedlings were even less imposing, and finally to the pecan block in the northwest corner, where the transplants were the most substantial of the 3 species, but still looked, in the late afternoon light, like something a strong wind could undo without effort. He did not feel doubt. He felt the specific quality of patience that long decisions require, the understanding that the thing you have done is correct, and that the time required to demonstrate its correctness is simply the nature of the decision rather than evidence against it. He had done the analysis 3 times. He had consulted 2 experts whose work he had evaluated carefully before trusting. He had looked at demonstration systems with his own eyes and had walked the rows and had talked to the farmers who had planted them. The trees were in the ground. The alley crops were planned. The plan was as good as 3 years of careful thinking could make it. Roy Kitts was at the fence line again on a Tuesday in June when Dale was spraying the alleys between the cottonwood rows to manage competition for the new transplants. Roy asked how the trees were coming along. Dale said they were coming along. Roy said he could barely see them from here. Dale said they were 18 inches tall. They were not going to be visible from the fence line for a while. Roy said he supposed so. He did not say anything else, but the not saying was its own kind of communication. The summer of 2019 was hot and dry, which was a problem for newly transplanted trees in their first growing season, and which meant that Dale spent more time on establishment watering than he had planned, and which also meant that the alley crop between the cottonwood rows underperformed because of the same drought conditions. He lost 11 cottonwood transplants in the lower section, about a 7% failure rate, and 6 cherry bark oak seedlings in the middle section, about a 4% rate, and 1 pecan, which he replaced in the fall with a container-grown transplant from a nursery in Indianola. The losses were within the range Bobby Tran had told him to expect, and he replaced the failed transplants in October when the weather had moderated and the soil moisture had recovered. By the end of the first growing season, the surviving cottonwoods were 4 to 5 feet tall and beginning to look like what they were going to be rather than what they had been when they went in. The cherry bark oaks were 2 to 3 feet, slower but solid. The pecans had made modest growth and were holding. Dale recorded the height measurements by tree in a management notebook he had started in the spring, and noted the replacement plantings and the alley crop yields and the water and herbicide applications. He had 419 trees alive and established at the end of year 1 out of 430 planted. Roy Kitts saw the cottonwood growth when he drove the county road past Dale's lower section in October of 2019, and he called across the fence line that at least the cottonwoods seemed to be coming up. Dale said yes, they were. Roy said cottonwood was not valuable timber. Dale said eastern cottonwood in alluvial bottomland with the right management could produce 50 to 60 cubic feet of wood per tree at a 12-year rotation. Roy said he would believe it when he saw it. Dale said he would see it. In the spring of 2020, the cottonwoods put on growth that visibly changed the character of the lower section. The surviving transplants pushed 8 to 12 feet in the second growing season, the exceptional growth rate that made eastern cottonwood the right species for the short rotation component of this system, putting on wood at a pace that no other hardwood species in the region could approach. By July, they were 12 to 14 feet, and the rows were becoming visible from the county road as something intentional rather than accidental. The regular spacing telling any knowledgeable eye that what was happening in Dale Mercer's lower field was a deliberate planting rather than a fence row volunteer stand. Dr. Calvin Reyes came to the property that summer as part of a monitoring visit he was doing on agroforestry demonstration plantings in the Delta region, and he walked the rows with Dale and measured growth on a sample of trees in each section and recorded the data in the monitoring program he maintained for the Extension Service. He said the cottonwood growth was at the high end of what he had projected for this soil type and this rainfall year, which had recovered from the previous summer's drought. He said the cherry bark oak establishment was solid, which mattered more than the visible growth because oak establishment in the first 2 years was the critical factor for long-term stand quality. He said the pecan block looked healthy and was showing the root development that suggested the trees would begin producing nuts in the projected timeline. He also said something that Dale wrote down in the management notebook that evening. He said that in 12 years of monitoring agroforestry plantings in Mississippi, he had not seen a farmer who had done as thorough a pre-planting analysis as Dale had done, and that in his observation, the farmers whose systems performed best were almost always the ones who had spent the most time studying the decision before they made it, rather than the ones who had moved fastest. He said that was not surprising, but it was worth saying, because the pressure in row crop farming culture was almost always toward action over analysis, and that agroforestry required a different relationship with time. Dale thanked him and said he had 3 years of thinking to justify before one seedling went in the ground, and that if he had not done that thinking, he would not have had the confidence to get through the first difficult year. Roy Kitz's comments continued through 2020 and into 2021, shifting in character as they went. In the summer of 2020, when the cottonwoods were 12 feet and the rows were visible from the road, his fence line observations had moved from the amusement of the first year to a kind of stubborn skepticism that was different in quality, more defended, the way a position becomes when it is beginning to feel the pressure of evidence moving in the wrong direction. He said 12-foot cottonwood was still 30 years from commercial timber. Dale said 12-year cottonwood in alluvial bottomland was commercial timber, and that Roy was confusing cottonwood with the slower species. Roy said he had never heard of anyone in Yalobusha County making money on cottonwood timber. Dale said that was likely because nobody in Yalobusha County had planted it in an alley cropping system with the density and management that produced commercial-grade timber, and that what nobody had done before was not evidence against doing it. Roy said he guessed they would see. Dale said yes, they would see. The pecan trees began producing in the fall of 2023, 4 years after planting, which was within the range Bobby Tran and Dr. Reyes had projected, and 1 year earlier than the conservative estimate Dale had used in his financial analysis. The nuts were modest in quantity, as expected from young trees in their first producing year, but the quality was high, the pecans large and well-filled, and Dale sold the first harvest through a specialty pecan buyer in Grenada, who paid premium prices for unprocessed pecans from managed orchards. The check was not large. It was the first income from the agroforestry system beyond the alley crops, and it was on time, which was the thing that mattered. Roy was at the fence line when Dale came back from delivering the pecan load. He asked how it went. Dale said it went fine. Roy asked what he got for them. Dale told him the price per pound. Roy said that was a decent price. Dale said it was, Roy said how many pounds did he have? Dale told him. Roy calculated the total and said that was not much for 4 years of waiting. Dale said it was the first year. He said trees did not produce on a human schedule of impatience. Roy said he supposed not. The first cottonwood thinning took place in October of 2023, 4.5 years after planting. The timing determined by the stand density management plan Bobby Tran had designed, and that Dale had been following since the beginning. The cottonwoods in the lower section had reached 22 to 26 feet of height and were beginning to compete with each other for canopy space in the rows. The point at which the management plan called for removing every other tree in the rows to allow the remaining trees to develop larger diameter crowns and higher value wood. Dale had contracted a small timber buyer from the Delta region named Marcus Webb, who had done cottonwood thinning work on other alley cropping operations in the region, and who came to the property in September to assess the thinning material and give Dale a price. Marcus walked the rows and measured diameter at breast height on a sample of trees and assessed the straightness and form of the material. He said the stand was above average for a 4.5-year cottonwood planting and that the material was suitable for the pulpwood and oriented strand board market, which was not premium timber, but was a real commercial market with real pricing. He offered Dale a price per ton for the thinning material. Dale accepted. The thinning operation ran for 4 days in October. Marcus's crew removed 206 trees from the cottonwood rows, leaving 213 trees, standing with doubled canopy space to develop toward the commercial saw timber rotation at year 12. The thinning check came to $11,400. Dale deposited the check and called Dr. Reyes to report the outcome. Reyes said the price per ton was consistent with current Delta region cottonwood pulpwood markets and that the stand density after thinning looked correct from the measurements Dale described. He said the remaining stand was well positioned for the commercial saw timber rotation at year 12, and that the diameter growth in the next 8 years should produce trees in the saw log size class that the premium markets wanted. Roy Kitts had watched the thinning operation from his fence line. He had watched Marcus Webb's crew run the harvester through the rows and had seen the thinned material loaded onto the log truck and had seen the truck pull out onto the county road. He had not said anything during the 4 days of the operation. When the truck was gone and Dale was walking the thinned rows looking at the remaining stand, Roy had called across the fence line and asked how much he got. Dale told him. Roy was quiet for a moment. He said $11,000 for 4-year cottonwood. Dale said it was thinning material, not final harvest. He said the final harvest at year 12 would be commercial saw timber, which was a different market and a different price. Roy said what did he think that would come to. Dale said based on current projections and the growth rate he was seeing, and he wanted to be conservative. He thought the final cottonwood harvest from the lower section at year 12 would be in the range of $40,000 to $50,000, not counting the alley crop income he had made in every season in between. Roy did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That is more than I expected." Dale said he knew. He said the numbers had surprised him too when he first ran them, which was why he had run them 3 times with different assumptions before he planted anything. Roy said he had thought it was a fool's project. Dale said he knew that too. There was a pause. Roy looked at the standing rows of cottonwood, the remaining trees now with full canopy space, 20 to 24 feet of clean bole below the first branches, the kind of stand that anyone who knew timber could look at and understand as something that was going somewhere. He said, "How much of this did you plan out before you planted?" Dale said 3 years. Roy said 3 years of planning before 1 tree went in. Dale said yes. Roy thought about that. He said that was a different way of farming from what he did. Dale said it was a different way of farming from what he had done too. Up until the year he paid off the land and looked at the numbers and understood that doing what everyone else in the county was doing on the same ground in the same market would produce the same results it had always produced. which was adequate in good years and not adequate in bad ones, and never going to be more than that. He said the trees had not been a gamble. They had been the result of 3 years of analysis that said this was the better use of this specific ground in this specific market context. He said the laughter at the fence line in the first year had been based on the assumption that he had not thought it through, and that the assumption was wrong. Roy said he owed Dale an apology. Dale said he did not need an apology. He said what he needed was for Roy to look at what was happening on this side of the fence line and consider whether any of it applied to his own operation. Because Roy had ground in his lower section along the creek that Dale had always thought was wasted on soybeans, and that would respond to cottonwood or cypress, or maybe a riparian buffer system the same way Dale's ground was responding, and that the Extension Service had people who could help Roy think through what made sense for his specific situation. Roy said he would think about it. Dale said that was all he was asking. The cherry bark oak in the middle section was 5 years old in 2024 and was looking the way a well-established cherry bark oak stand looked at 5 years, which was to say, not impressive to anyone who did not know oak timber, but entirely correct to anyone who did. The trees were 6 to 9 feet tall with the clean, single-leader form that indicated good establishment. Frank Hollis had walked the middle section with Dale in March of 2024. And had said the stand quality was among the best he had seen in a Delta region cherry bark planting of this age. He said the trees were on track for the commercial thinning at year 15 and the final harvest at year 25, and that the financial projections Dale had used in his original analysis remained valid, possibly conservative given the current direction of hardwood timber markets. The 3 years of planning had looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. Dale had not announced what he was studying. He had sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and read and made notes and run spreadsheets and done all of it quietly and thoroughly and without requiring an audience. His daughter Meg had asked him once, in the 2nd year of his planning, what he was spending so much time on in the evenings. He had shown her the analysis. She sat at the table and read through the yield projections and said, "Dad, this looks like it actually works." He said he thought so too, but that he had run the numbers 3 times to be sure. She asked why 3 times. He said, "Because a decision you are going to live with for 25 years deserves to be right before you commit to it." The alley crops between the cottonwood rows had produced every season since the planting, at or above the county average by year 3, while the trees themselves were an additional asset growing in value on the same land. This was the design of the system. The land never stopped producing in the near term, while it was also building value in the long term. He walked the cottonwood rows on the last Sunday of October 2024, 5.5 years after the planting, the trees now at 28 to 32 feet and carrying the unmistakable quality of commercial timber in development. The remaining 213 trees after the thinning had responded to the increased canopy space with accelerated diameter growth, the boles thickening toward the diameter class the sawtimber market wanted. In 6.5 years, they would be ready for the final harvest. Some people, when he mentioned the 25-year oak rotation, looked at him with the concern of people who had calculated his age against the harvest date. Dale had a response he gave once, and only once. A man who stopped planting trees because he might not live to see the harvest was a man who had decided that the future of his land was only relevant for as long as he was personally present to observe it. He did not believe that and had not farmed that way and did not intend to start. The land would be here after him. The trees would be here after him. The management notebook would be on the shelf, and whoever came after him would have a system already in place and a record of how it had developed, and a set of decisions made by someone who had thought carefully about what the land needed and had planted accordingly. He went back outside. There was still work to do before the day was done. The 3 years of planning had looked from the outside like nothing at all. Dale had not announced what he was studying. He had not told Roy or the other neighbors or anyone at the county extension meetings that he was reading about agroforestry systems and running numbers on timber yields and talking to a researcher at Mississippi State. He had sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and read and made notes and run spreadsheets and called Dr. Reyes 2 times and Frank Hollis once, and had done all of it quietly and thoroughly and without requiring an audience. His daughter Meg had asked him once, in the second year of his planning before the planting, what he was spending so much time working on in the evenings. He had shown her the analysis. She sat at the table and read through the yield projections and the timber market research and the financial comparisons, and at the end she said, "Dad, this looks like it actually works." He said he thought so too, but that he had run the numbers 3 times to be sure. She asked why 3 times. He said because a decision you are going to live with for 25 years deserves to be right before you commit to it. Meg came to the farm in the spring of 2020 when the cottonwoods were putting on their exceptional second-year growth, and walked the rows with Dale and looked at the 12-foot trees and said she could see it now. She could see what the plan was. He said it was easier to see once the trees were growing. She said she had been able to see it in the spreadsheet, but she had not been able to feel it until she was standing in the middle of it. He said that was why he had walked demonstration systems before planting, because the spreadsheet told you what was true, and the standing in the middle of it told you what was real, and both kinds of knowing were necessary. The alley crops between the cottonwood rows had produced every season since the planting. Not at the county average in the first 2 years because tree establishment costs had to be absorbed, but at or above it by year 3 and beyond. By 2023, the alley crops in the lower section were generating returns essentially equivalent to what the full 60-acre section had produced in row crops before the trees went in, while the trees themselves were an additional asset growing in value on the same land. Dale had tried to explain this design to Roy once in the summer of 2021. He said in a properly designed alley cropping system, the land never stopped producing in the near term, while it was also building long-term value. The design was the thing that made it work economically, not the trees alone or the crops alone, but the specific relationship between them and the way the management shifted over time as the trees developed. Roy had listened. He had not dismissed it, which was different from the earlier years. Something in his posture had shifted by 2021. The laughter was gone, replaced by a watchfulness that was evaluative rather than certain, the posture of a man whose prior conviction is being modified by what he is seeing. Roy Kitts had started a conversation with Dr. Calvin Reyes in the spring of 2024 about his Lower Creek section. He had called the extension office and Reyes had called him back, and they had talked for 45 minutes. Reyes sent him reading material and offered to walk the creek section in the fall. Roy had told Dale about the conversation at the fence line one morning in June, not as an admission but as information. The way neighbors shared information when they had been neighbors long enough to get past the years of fence line skepticism and arrived at something that worked better for both of them. Dale said that was good news and that Reyes was the right person to talk to, and that if Roy had questions about what the first year of an agroforestry planting looked like from the inside, he was welcome to ask. Roy said he might take him up on that. Dale said the offer stood. He walked the cottonwood rows on the last Sunday of October 2024, 5.5 years after the planting. The trees, now at 28 to 32 feet, and carrying the unmistakable quality of commercial timber in development. The remaining 213 trees, after the thinning, had responded to the increased canopy space with accelerated diameter growth, the boles thickening toward the diameter class the sawtimber market wanted. In 6.5 years, they would be ready for the final harvest. The cherry bark oak rows in the middle section were quiet in the way oak stands were quiet, slow, and certain. Frank Hollis had walked the middle section in March of 2024 and said the stand quality was among the best he had seen in a Delta region cherry bark planting of this age. On track for commercial thinning at year 15 and final harvest at year 25. The financial projections from the original analysis remained valid. possibly conservative given the current direction of hardwood timber markets. Some people, when he mentioned the 25-year oak rotation, looked at him with the concern of people who had calculated his age against the harvest date. Dale had a response he gave once, and only once. A man who stopped planting trees because he might not live to see the harvest was a man who had decided that the future of his land was only relevant for as long as he was personally present to observe it. He did not believe that. The land would be here after him. The trees would be here after him. The management notebook would be on the shelf, and whoever came after him on this ground would have a system already in place, and a record of how it had developed, and a set of decisions made by someone who had thought carefully about what the land needed and had planted accordingly. He went and checked the pecan block, where the trees were producing their third crop and where the yield per tree was up 40% over the first year. The slow compounding of bearing capacity in a young orchard finding its production rhythm. The way things found their rhythm when they were properly established and properly managed and given the time they needed. He looked at the northwest corner where the pecan canopies were filling in the spacing between the trees and beginning to look, for the first time, like an orchard rather than a planting. He looked at the cottonwood rows in the lower section. He looked at the oak rows in the middle section, slow and certain, building wood and value without hurry and without apology, and on their own timeline that had nothing to do with the impatience of the people around them. He had planted 430 trees while Roy Kitts laughed at the fence line. The laughter had been the reaction of a man who measured farming by the season and could not see the plan in what looked, in the spring of 2019, like a 63-year-old man putting sticks in the ground of his best cropland. Dale had not been putting sticks in the ground. He had been putting the next 25 years of this farm's income in the ground, one tree at a time, on a plan he had thought through for 3 years before he started, at a pace that was not exciting to watch and was not designed to be. He closed the management notebook and set it on the shelf and went back out to the field. The trees did not require his approval to grow. They required his management and his patience. He had both and intended to keep both for as long as the land needed them.